I originally conceived of writing a memoir in 1983 after 5 years of harrowing and bizarre experience, beginning with an accident in the Peace Corps in 1978, which took my wife's life and left me with multiple surgeries and hospitalizations. I and others thought it would make a good story, but that I was too young for a memoir. I agreed and put it off and spent what turned out to be 30 years of reading, research, therapy, and meditation practice that took me all over the U.S., Japan, and Europe, even one 5-week trip to Nepal and India. Through this time, I had many encounters with beats, hippies, New Agers, and many others, which contributed to the view you see in the memoir, which is subtitled Memoir of a Dharma Bum Who Survived. I wrote it inspired by and responding to Kerouac, Ginsberg, and the Beats, but I really don't quite get to Kerouac's style or prose. It comes out a good bit different. But like Kerouac, after 30 years of thinking about a memoir, I wrote it in a couple of hours a day over 6 to 8 weeks. The cover and the excerpt that explicates it are indeed a reference to Tibetan meditative practices, but a criticism of the beat, hippie, and New Age interpretations and guesses about that practice. Here is the excerpt. Afterward, feel free to question or comment at 347-826-7370. The excerpt is from the chapter titled Blaming Japhy Rider 2010. It opens with a short snippet from Allen Ginsberg's Howl. Incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind leaping toward poles of Canada and Peterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Allen Ginsberg, Howl. Here's the excerpt. In about 1990 or so, I wrote to Allen Ginsberg enclosing a sample of my poetry and asked if he wouldn't mind reviewing it. To my surprise, he answered it and he reviewed it, writing his review of my work on the back of the letter I had written him. In his own hand, he commented that my writing was a head trip and that I should read more Kerouac. He also told me that Trungpa's poetry had been positively influenced by discussions with Allen's and some of the other beats. I was quite pleased to have heard from him at all and made a mental note to read more Kerouac. I never wrote that much poetry anyway, but as I was writing somewhat in the Tibetan style, I was curious about Allen's take on it, or anyone's take on it really. I suspected that Allen just wasn't sure if he knew me or not, and so he responded just in case. It took me quite a number of years to actually get to reading Kerouac as Allen suggested, and around the same time I decided to write the memoir. I read Kerouac and Allen's advice. I read Kerouac with Allen's advice in mind, and with an eye toward getting some idea of how to write a memoir. My writing experience was limited to lots of academic material and a couple of screenplays, so I needed some idea of what to do with a memoir. While in Monterey, I would frequent a bar that was an old Steinbeck haunt, just up the street from Cannery Row. I wondered if Kerouac had been there. Big Sur, a place that he visited, and the title of one of his memoirs, was just 45 minutes away, and he may have stopped in, looking to chat with Steinbeck. I checked around a bit and found out the 102-year-old owner of the bar remembered Steinbeck, but never liked him. Steinbeck was a bit of a drunk, according to her, and would often mooch drinks from people. I thought about asking her directly about Kerouac, but her daughter and caretaker told me that her memory was failing, so I decided not to bother her. What was really interesting to me was that the woman was still able to come down to the bar, which she did on Thursdays when she would have a few drinks, and on her 102nd birthday she actually had 8 drinks and left a bit drunk. Steinbeck and his friends also had a habit of scooping up drinks deserted by exiting patrons, mixing the leftovers into a cocktail and then drinking those to save money. I checked around some more, and a couple of guys in their 90s, and the pictures I had printed out looked very familiar to them, but they couldn't say for sure if that was Kerouac. In his memoir entitled Big Sur, Kerouac discusses Monterey, but pretty much just at the last bus stop from San Francisco on the way to Big Sur. He had to hitchhike the last 45 miles. He was waiting for a bus at one point in Monterey on his way back to San Francisco, and he wandered the streets of Monterey a bit, but there was no mention of him going into the city far enough to look for Steinbeck. It sounded to me like Kerouac just wandered around close to the bus station. Steinbeck haunt is about 2 miles away. I chose Kerouac's Dharma Bums for the first book to read. At first, his reports on the beat study of Buddhism heartened me, but later I was quite aghast at these descriptions. His his depiction of the poet Japhy Ryder in particular. Kerouac was very widely read by the beats and the hippies and the Dharma bums, that is, the Buddhists who were traveling around different centers or just reading on the subject. They read a lot of Kerouac. I'm sure millions of copies at least were sold, and in many different languages. What troubled me was that Kerouac, in his ever generous and gentle manner, described scenes with Japhy writing, having sex in the Tibetan ritual style on the floor during parties and with multiple partners, and Japhy always encourages others to do the same. Kerouac never criticized Japhy. Further, he reported that Japhy said that Tibetans were like that, and that this was what Tibetan Buddhism was all about, cross-legged sex on the floor in front of other people. A great Chinese lie, I thought. At first, I thought it was irresponsible for Kerouac even to report such a thing, but then I decided that, as he wasn't that much of a scholar, he might actually have believed Japhy. It would be difficult to know, as Kerouac always reported gently rather than critically. But in the memoir, Kerouac comes off as too shy and actually too respectful of women to have tried the Japhy variation on the Tibetan practice. But as Japhy had pretenses to being an expert in Zen and things Buddhist, and as his translations of Japanese Zen poetry into English gave him a bit of credentials in the area, I thought that he should have been more discerning and less licentious in his rapid jump to conclusions on the Tibetan lifestyle. There was certainly nothing to suggest that he had done any reading or practice that would have led him to those orgiastic conclusions, other than credulity in the face of the critics of the Tibetans, those who had dismissed the entirety of the culture and religion with that one foolish lie. Feel free to call with comments or questions.